So let's get started. Here's the agenda. This is how it's going to we're going to walk through. We're going to look at what are the migration options, what are the criteria you use to pick an migration solution. Then we'll do a deep dive into hybrid. We'll look at what is the life cycle of a migration, what are the phases you need to go through. We'll do some troubleshooting, common issues that you will encounter during migration. Then we'll look at some of the performance problems that you might encounter, how to analyze them, and how to fine-tune your system to overcome as much as possible. Some of the key takeaways I want you to have is that we have a simple set of tools to help you move to the cloud. Additionally, we have launched some programs that will help you onboard easily as well. So let's get started. So any migration that you do starts with a deployment plan. And the deployment plan, in my mind, consists of 4 phases: plan, prepare, migrate, and decommission. So in the plan phase, read docs, read case studies, get yourself prepared. And in the prepare phase, you prepare the on-premise environment and the cloud environment. And the preparation steps depends really on the migration choice. And the migration solution, we have a bunch of them. Once you migrate, then you can decommission. So how do you pick a migration solution? So first, what are the migration solutions that we have? So I broadly classify it into tools that we provide, Microsoft provides, and then tools that third party provides. And this talk is more focused on the tools that we provide. And we provide about 4 tools. I call them, we have the IMAP solution, and then the migrating from Exchange solutions. So as the name suggests, IMAP is any IMAP server you can migrate. It's not a high fidelity migration, so you can only migrate mail. You will not be able to migrate calendar, contacts, etc. But we have 3 solutions for migrating from Exchange. We have the cutover, stage, and hybrid. And all these 3 solutions is high fidelity migration solutions. There are differences in nuances, and that we'll discuss a little bit later. Okay, so we have 3 solutions. How do you pick which one to use? Well, let me try painting a picture considering a bunch of characteristics. So the first thing I look at is the size of the organization. So we've seen that size of organizations can vary, anywhere from a few users to several thousand users, so 25, 35, whatever. And as the size of the organization increases, we also know that time to migrate increases. And as the time to migrate increases, the complexity of migration as well increases. So for small orgs like 100 people, you can migrate them over a weekend or a couple of days. For large orgs, it can take anywhere between several weeks to several months, as many of you very well know. And as the time to migrate increases, the need for coexistence increases. Meaning that what I mean by coexistence or hybrid is that some mailboxes are on-premise and some mailboxes are in the cloud, and as you're migrating. And so the time that this configuration exists continues to increase as the complexity or the size of the organization increases. So as this configuration time increases, there's a need for features to work across mailboxes in the cloud and mailboxes on-premise, and therefore a need for coexistence. And the feature set also, the fidelity of the feature set also increases. So for example, in a small org, you don't need any coexistence. For medium org, maybe who are migrating over a couple of weeks, maybe all you need to configure is mail flow. And that's all you need, GalSync and mail flow. And then for large size orgs, people want FreeBSD, archiving in the cloud, etc. And so for each one of these solutions or requirements, we have solutions. So the cutover Exchange migration is meant for small size orgs, which will migrate typically over a week or weekend to the cloud. And today the configuration is such that you can move up to 2,000 users using cutover Exchange migration. And I've seen people do that. I've seen people migrate 1,500 users using cutover, but typical norm is about 50 to 100 users. And the cutover Exchange migration solution does a one-shot sync, which is it goes, discovers the users, groups, contacts, and provisions them in the cloud, and then migrates the mail. And then once you're done, you can go switch the MX record over. You can keep it, you can like start the migration on a Monday and let it go sync through the weekend and then do the MX flip over the weekend. It doesn't need to be right away as well. The stage migration is a bit of is meant for a little bit bigger size orgs. And the way it works is you move batches of users to the cloud. So it's very similar to hybrid, but it also uses cutover. It uses DIRSync for provisioning, and then we use the same protocol as cutover for content migration. Then the hybrid comes, and this is the protocol which we will talk a little bit about today, which is meant for large size organizations. And it's full fidelity migrations where you need to establish a hybrid environment before using the hybrid moves. Okay, so now that we looked at these solutions, let's do a little bit of a deep down into hybrid moves. I'll open up for questions right now since I'm starting a new section. Any questions on this? Go ahead.
Any plans on bringing the IMAP migration to on-premise?
No plans on bringing IMAP to on-premise. So any other questions? So I will do a feature ask run through at the end if you want. So I did this yesterday at the Unplugged talk. I went around and asked people what are the top features you want. And we can do that with IMAP as well, and we can read this exercise and see what this audience thinks. Okay? So hybrid moves. We can do hybrid moves in two ways. You can do the individual moves or the batch moves, and that's how I classify this space. And in individual move is a commandlet-only interface, which is many of you may be familiar with. This is a new move request. And you issue a new move request in the commandlet, and we'll do the moves using MRS underneath the covers. And there's this batch moves that we introduced a couple of years ago, which is what we recommend everyone use. And this is a high level of abstraction over the individual moves. The batch moves is much richer. It's got rich EAC management capabilities, where it's got async injection. So what I mean is you can provide a batch of users, and we'll take care of injecting all these move requests underneath the covers. So if there is any injection failure, we'll take care of the retries. We as a service will take care of it. It's protocol agnostic. So if you learn how to do batch moves for the move protocol, then you will know how to do it for IMAP, cutover, or stage. Because it's the same commandlets, it's the same syntax, it's the same management experience. So you learn one tool, you'll be familiar with all the other tools. We provide source server throttling. So Office 365 is a big beast. We have a lot of resource and capacity on the target. And so if you inject 1,000 moves, we could actually try migrating all the 1,000 moves simultaneously. But the problem with that is your source service will tank, especially if it's not beefy enough. If your 1,000 moves go against 2 servers, then we'll have 1,000 servers against 2, and then the source servers will get throttled quite a bit. And so to prevent that kind of throttling and overwhelming the source environment, we provide source server throttlings, which you can configure. And so you can inject a batch of 10,000 moves or 1,000 moves, and you can configure your source server throttling to about 10. So that means that at any point in time, we can move about 10 users. We also provide email reporting. So at the end of initial sync and finalization, which are various phases, we send out emails to admins saying, hey, you know what, migration complete. So you can just kick off and go home, and then you can get some progress notifications. So these are all advantages, and we continue to improve this. So let me walk through migration lifecycle and see what it takes to create a batch and kick it off. The first step in any migration is first to create a migration endpoint. Once you create an endpoint, you create a batch and start the batch. Once the migration finishes, you will get a report. You review the report, and then you complete the batch. You review in the report, you look at, hey, whether I migrated all the data, or I didn't migrate the data, and those kinds of things. So let's look at each one of these steps and what it means. Creating a migration endpoint. Well, what is this migration endpoint? It's a configuration that represents the source environment. It represents where the server is that you need to go connect to, to be able to pull in the data. In this case, this is where the MRS proxy is running for us to pull in the data. We have 3 types of migration endpoints, each tied to a protocol. We have the Exchange Remote Move migration endpoint, which is for the hybrid moves, which is what we'll use. And there are two others, which is for Outlook Anywhere, which is for cutover and staged, and IMAP for the IMAP protocol. So you'll see again that the concepts that exist are applicable to all the protocols, and we kind of reuse the concepts and help you stay with a certain management paradigm. Another couple of things that the migration endpoint captures is credentials, the admin credentials. So you can create a management endpoint with the admin credential and then keep reusing it across multiple batches. We also provide the throttling configurations here that help you throttle the source servers. I'll talk a bit more about that during the performance sections of this talk. So once you create the migration endpoint, so you can create it either in dashboard by clicking on these 3 ellipses in the migration dashboard, and it'll open up a dashboard a panel here. In this case, I have 2 endpoints, EP1 and EP2, and if I click on one of these endpoints, I'll get the endpoint configuration. And we'll look at all this a little bit more in detail during the demos. We can also do this so you get this configuration, and you can also do this through commandlet. So we have this new migration endpoint commandlet that takes in a couple of parameters. The first one is the name of the migration endpoint, that's a friendly name, and then the protocol. So I said there are 3 types. You specify the type here. Here I specified as Exchange Remote Move. And migration endpoint, you can also auto-discover. So you don't need to manually enter the server name. You can just say auto-discover and provide the auto-discover details. So we'll go scan in the target environment to see where the cache boxes are, where the MRS proxy is running, and we'll figure out the servers automatically. So we also support the auto-discover option. So once you specify the endpoint, the next step is to create the batch. You have 2 options to create the batch. One is you can use the picker to pick the set of users, and the picker will pick all the MEUs available in the cloud. So once you set up the environment, the hybrid environment, DirSync would have synced all the users to the cloud, and when you open the picker, you will get all these users. So you can pick these users from the picker, or you can use the CSV. And the CSV schema looks something like this. It's called the email address. This is the target email address of the user you want to migrate. And you can specify bad item and large item limits. And I'll talk a little bit more about what each one of these mean in the later part of my talk. In commandlet, we have this commandlet also called new migration batch. Similarly, you can specify the name for the migration batch, and you specify a source endpoint. This is the endpoint that we created in the previous step. So the identity of the endpoint you specify here, and you specify something called target delivery domain. I'll talk a bit more about target delivery domain when I show the demo, but it's a domain that is used to route mail to for the users that we have migrated. And then specify the CSV of the users that you want to migrate. So that's the commandlet. So once you do this, you start the batch, and you go through a phase called initial sync, where all the data gets copied. Once the data is copied, you get an email report. The email report looks something like this. It says something like, hey, who started this batch? When was it started? And how long did it run? And how many mailboxes were synced? And then you also have a link in this report saying, click on this to download the details. And if you click on this, you'll get the details of the user's details. And the things that are interesting are like items migrated and items skipped. An item skipped is the set of items that we didn't migrate. And I'll talk about why we don't migrate some of the items. So once you review the report, you can also review the report in the dashboard, which I again will show you during the demos. Or you can also download the report from the dashboard as well if you lose the email. And once you review the report, you complete the migration. So there are 2 forms of completions that we support. So what is the completion phase? So a completion phase is where you switch the users over to the target environment. And the completion phase, we have 2. We have the automatic completion, and then we have a manual completion. An automatic completion is when you kick off the batch, it automatically completes after initial sync. So it does an initial sync, And then it does something called incremental sync, where we do a delta sync. We copy the data, delta data over, and then we finalize. In finalization, what happens is completion. We lock the source mailbox, and then do another delta sync, and then switch the users over. So we convert the mailbox on the on-premise to an MEU, and switch the user over. And this is a critical phase, because this is where end users don't have access to their mailbox. And this is and so we want to minimize end users' impact. So my recommendation is to use always manual completion for onboarding. And the reason is it gives you an opportunity to go review the reports, make sure that you haven't skipped too many items and what kind of items you've skipped. It also gives you an opportunity to retry batch failures or move them off to another batch and things like that, those kinds of semantics that you can do. So it gives you more control. Automatic completion is, I recommend using it during local moves like load balancing in your on-premises environment. All these constructs that I talk about are applicable to your enterprise environment as well. You can use your all these to manage your enterprise 2013 boxes. Okay, so so this is a diagram that shows how these phases are. If you notice in this diagram, the initial incremental sync phase is really small. So we do an initial sync where all the data is copied, and quickly do an incremental sync, and then do completion. In manual completion, the initial sync phase can be large, because it's up to the admin to go click a button to do the completion phase. And he has the control over when he can do. Okay, so here are some of the commandlets that we have across the board for management of batches. There's a migration batch, new, start, stop, etc. There is also a migration user commandlet that looks at individual users in the batch. And then we have the migration endpoint, which represents the source environment. Later in the talk, Luke is going to demonstrate how to use many of these things and use it to investigate failures. So I'm going to skip talking a little bit more about these. At this point, let's go to a demo. And in this demo, we're going to look at a migration dashboard. We're going to kick off a new migration batch by using the picker. And then once we kick off the batch, we'll go look at some of the other batches and get a sense of how the dashboard looks. Later in the talk, we'll look at investigating failures. And then later in the talk, we'll also look at troubleshooting some performance issues. And how do you go about doing that? Okay? All right, so I think we can open up for questions now.
Okay, my question was, is this the same if you're running Exchange 2010?
Can you clarify the question?
Yeah, I spent a couple sessions this week contemplating install. I'm in a 2010 environment, and I would decide not to install 2013 servers for the hybrid connectivity, and I was suggested that I don't do that. So now I'm staying with 2010. Is all the batch feature migrations the same?
So from on-premise to the cloud, you can use the batch features.
Okay.
In on-premise environment, we don't support the batch features. So what I mean by that, yeah. So yeah, from on-premise to the cloud, yes, you can, absolutely. Any more questions? Okay, go ahead.
What is the command that you stop the batch or complete the batch? I didn't see complete on the command list.
So that is a complete migration batch. So maybe I didn't show it. It's a mistake. Okay. I'll show you in the demo. So there is a way to stop and complete migration batches. Yes.
Is there a logic inbuilt where it identifies a dependency on send on behalf, so we include those in the same batch or send as dependency, so it can flag that no dependency?
So the question is, there are two people who have dependencies. Can you group these dependencies together, and do you do any sort of support around that? In the migration toolsets, we don't. Have you guys attended the Fast Track talk? Okay, so the Fast Track guys have a bunch of tools that do identify these kinds of dependencies and help you co-locate the batches. And then once you prepare the batch, you can inject it. So we are at the phase where you prepare the batch and you inject. There are things we are thinking about on how to simplify this a little bit more, but those are all still in the thinking phase. Any more questions? All right. All right, so let's do the demo. All right, so this is the migration dashboard. I went to the Exchange Admin Center, and in the Recipients tab, I clicked on Migration to get here. I did this up ahead. So we have a bunch of batches here, B1 to B6, many of them in various states, just to show and help you investigate these errors. This is the status of the batch. If it's in synced, it means that it's done initial sync, and it hasn't completed. When I click on complete migration batch, let's say I click on this one. So this will allow me to complete the batch and switch these users over. Are you sure you want to complete the batch? I said yes. So this helps me complete a batch. Now let's also go. Okay, it's a little slow. So once the batch completion kicks off, everything happens asynchronously on the back end. So you will see our status updates as it's completing. We can also go create a new batch, and let's try doing that. So there are two modes of operation here: either migrate to Exchange Online or migrate away from Exchange Online. We prefer going to Exchange Online, so let's try that. And we have really 4 options for migrating to Exchange Online. These are the 4 toolsets we just talked about. And you see that the management experience for all the 4 toolsets is the same. It's just a bunch of configurations that you take in are going to be a little different. So we try to unify this experience across the board. And in this case, 3 of the 4 toolsets are enabled. Cutover is not enabled. And the reason cutover is not enabled is cutover doesn't work if you install DirSync. So we detect that you have installed DirSync, and we disable cutover. And for hybrid, I had to set up DirSync in the hybrid environment so I could demo this up ahead. So for this demo, I'm going to click on Remote Moves. And I have 2 options here. As I said before, I can select from the picker or specify CSV. One more thing that I want to announce here is that we added this option in the last year to allow unknown columns in the CSV. I believe customers at MEC asked us to do this. So we added this where the requirement was that people had custom CSVs, and they didn't want to transform those custom CSVs to adhere to what the tools wanted. So just wanted to provide their CSV so it just worked. And so we added this option that says allow unknown columns in the CSV. So as long as you have our required column, which is the email address, we are okay. You can have whatever other columns you want. So in this case, I'm just going to pick from the picker here. And this is loading up all the MEUs in the organization. You can do some filtering as well, but I'm just going to load up some of these MEUs. So let's pick the users in 90. And I'm going to add them to a batch. So I multi-selected all these users, and I'm clicking Next. At this point, since I have already created a bunch of batches, I had pre-created an endpoint. So the system says, the service says, you know what, you have this endpoint, do you really want to use this again? And since I have just one endpoint, it just auto-populates that endpoint for me and gives it to me. If I needed more if I had more endpoints, it would give me a drop-down list. So I'm saying, yeah, I just want this endpoint because ignite-now.info is the org I want to use, domain name that I want to use. And it's doing a bunch of tests underneath the covers. So it's running a command called test migration server availability to test the migration endpoint and to make sure that the endpoint is available and accessible. I'll take this after the demo. So once that test goes through, now I can go create a batch. So here I'll say demo. Hey. demo gods. Okay. All right. So then, I can say demo, and then there's this domain called target delivery domain, and it gets auto-populated. And this is the domain to which you want email address to get redirected to when you migrate to the cloud. And we automatically detect which is the target delivery domain you need to set up and specify that. Then we have two more options here. The first option says, which is the default, which is whether you want to migrate both the primary and the archive to the cloud. And this is the option you choose if you want to move mailboxes. There's another option where you want to just move the archive alone to the cloud, and you can select this option for just that. And we also have this thing called bad item limit and large item limit. And I'll talk about it a little bit later in the talk. And you can specify these configurations or leave it to the default. Once you do that, you have a bunch of more options, which is how do you want to start and complete. The default start mode is automatic. So once you create the batch, it will automatically start. If you don't want to do that, you can put a manual start. So you can like prepare the batches over Monday and keep it ready for starting over the next few days. Then you can do the manual start. And then you have the completion modes, which is manual versus automatic. And the completion, the default is manual, so that you can go review the reports after the batch is done. So I'm going to keep it as the defaults. And I also have a notification, recipe notification Dropbox, label, where I can specify which user can receive this notification email. And here it's typically the admin who kicks off the migration batch is the default, and I'm going to keep it to the default as well. And I'm going to click on new. At this point, underneath the covers, the EAC calls new migration batch commandlet that I had showed earlier and creates the batch. Let's wait till it creates the batch. So now we have two batches that are in syncing state. One is finalizing, another one is creating the, okay, never mind. So that concludes our demos. Any questions? Go ahead.
What are the certificate requirements for the endpoint you created? Would support a wildcard cert?
Yeah, so I created a certificate that specified the domain primary SMTP address and the auto-discover record, and you can also use the wildcard cert as well. Yeah. And it's a normal certificate requirement for any of these auto-discovers. And it should be third-party trusted. It's not self-signed. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that later. Okay. Why can I not do what?
So when you're doing a migration, the MRS and the utility and everything's doing that.
Uh-huh.
Knows what a bad item is.
Uh-huh.
Doesn't migrate.
Uh-huh.
Why can't you identify that in advance?
I'll talk about it, and I think I can answer your question. Okay. There are parts of the item that we can read, but we can't read the whole thing, and we read it only during a scanning time, which is when you kick off the migration. So we can't do it up ahead because we're not scanning it.
But is there a tool that can identify them in advance? So I can go to someone's mailbox and go, actually, this guy's got 5,000 bad items, so I need this item count higher than that, but he's only got 10. And then show me what they are. In a utilities, I can either review them or delete them, or let the user review them or delete them.
Okay, we'll talk about it. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Now, what are the advantages of leaving it at manually complete the migration batch instead of automatically complete the migration batch? Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so I recommend everyone do a manual completion for onboarding. And the reason is you want to review your policies. For example, say you kept a bad item as 100. And you see a bunch of users that completed successfully initial sync, but their bad item was like, their item skipped was like 98. Maybe you want to talk to that guy and say, you know what, these 98 mails is not getting migrated. You may want to like save them off before we migrate you because you're going to lose that 98 mails. And so also you want to like review some of the reports to see what kind of failures you got. Because say 10% of your batch failed for some reason. And you want to see what those failures are before completing the batch. People like more control over these kinds of completions. We also are introducing a new feature that I'm not demoing here because the bits are not deployed, which is called schedule completion, where you can actually specify the date at which you want to complete. And that's for a different reason as well. The reason is you want to do switchovers over the weekend. You don't want to sit over the weekend and keep pressing the button. So you do schedule completion. So you do initial sync over the week, and then you schedule your completion over the weekend, things like that. The user experience, so between the manual and automatic, it shouldn't be any different because what we do to minimize, so the biggest impact concerns I have from a user experience point is the completion time. So if the completion time is larger, then the user doesn't have access to his mailbox for that period of time because there is a lock on the mailbox. So in order to minimize the completion time, we do a periodic incremental sync. So we sync every so often so that there is less churn mailboxes. So when you do final sync, the final sync has just a quick sync because there's not much content there, and then we switch the user over. The switch user over is within less than 30 seconds. But that final sync can take some time. So another thing that you might want to know is the mailbox churning a lot? And if there is a lot of churn in a certain mailbox, then you might want to investigate and make sure that the user impact is minimized. So those are the things that you will see in the troubleshooting sections where we look at how do you minimize those impacts.
So just one last follow-up on that. You mentioned that you might see a lot of items that are skipped or they fail for whatever reason during the migration. What would you recommend as a good default to set the large and bad item limits at?
That's a good question. So we did an analysis in the cloud. So we set our defaults to be 0, 0. And then we said, let's see what's going on. And we got a lot of calls from support saying, calls to support, where customers are like, hey, my migrations are failing. And so we did some analysis and went through about 1,000, 2,000 customers to see what their default setting was, and then what were they experiencing. And we found that their default settings, many of them bumped their defaults to 50 to 100, and that's what the range was. But they were experiencing typically under 10 bad items per mailbox on an average. So we set the default in the UI. That's why I showed the default in the UI is about 10, because that will give you a success rate at the 95th percentile. So at 95% percentages of mailboxes will succeed if the bad item is at 10. And that's what we found as the typical number. But there are always outliers. I'm talking about percentiles here. Make sense? Okay.
So it's my understanding, when migrating from 2010 to Office 365, the accessing clients on the mobile devices will all be removed and recreated. Migrating from 2013 to Exchange Office Online.
Correct. That's
Clients will remain consistent.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah. All right. So let's get back to the talk. So up until now, we saw a lay of the land, what choices of the tools, walk through the life cycle, a demo of the hybrid moves. Now let's see how it all works underneath the covers. I'm going to walk you through a couple of architectures and show you what are the pieces that is involved in making these migrations happen. So the picture here on the right on the blue, on that side is the blue picture is the on-premise environment, which shows a bunch of 2010 cache servers. And behind that, there are a bunch of 2007 and 2010 mailbox servers. We also have an Active Directory there. This side is the Office 365 cloud. And there are two critical services here. One is called the migration service, which is the orchestration engine that provides you all this batch management capabilities. The other service that many of you may be familiar with is the MRS service, which is responsible for the actual data move. Now let's walk through what happens when you kick off a migration. So when an admin kicks off a migration, new migration batch command is issued to this migration service. Upon receiving this, it processes the CSV in the batch and then issues new move requests underneath the covers. Each one of these MRSs get a new move request, and multiple of these MRS kick off new move, migrations or start pulling data from the on-premise environment over the HTTPS protocol. All these requests end up in the CAS server, which is where the MRS proxy is running in 2010. The MRS proxy, in turn, will reach out to these various backends over MAPI, read the data over MAPI, push it into the cloud over HTTPS, and then the MRS in the cloud will write it to the data to the backend in XSO, using XSO. All these services, the MRS service and the MRS proxy service, run straight in the backend. We don't run it anywhere else. It's as close to the database as possible. And so from a throughput efficiency point of view, this is the most efficient way to do this architecture of this system. And then in finalization, the mailboxes in on-premise environment get converted to MEUs. And at this point, the clients and Mailflow get redirected to the cloud. It's very similar in the 2013 model as well. However, there are a couple of differences, and I'll highlight the difference. Again, the admin kicks off. The new move request is created underneath. Requests go out to the 2013 front ends. This is where the difference lies. The MRS proxy in 2013 is running in the back end, not in the CAS front end, not in the front end. So then the front end proxy requests to a 2013 backend over HTTP, and the 2013 backend in turn talks to the various backends either over MAPI or XSO. It uses XSO for 2013, MAPI for 2010 and below. And then the reverse flow is all similar and same. Okay. Now let's look at any questions on architecture. Go ahead.
So with the Exchange 2010,
Uh-huh.
so when you're moving from 365 to your 2010, that HTTPS traffic to the MRS proxy
Uh-huh.
on-prem, that goes through your external kind of UAG boxes or whatever your clients currently use to get your email externally. Office 365 is with a tool. So yeah, so you need to check that you're going to have an impact on your Outlook Anywhere endpoint as soon as you start spanking mailboxes through.
Correct. You configure the new migration endpoint to this server, this CAS box, and that's how MRS knows that it needs to talk to that endpoint.
If you only have one external presence or external URL, the client's using one.
Yeah, so if you have, correct. It's good. Correct. Or you can throttle. So that's why we'll talk about how to throttle the environment so that. Correct. Go ahead.
Do you have any plans yet at all to allow for migrations where you can do date range? So at this, it's all or nothing. You get the whole mailbox or nothing.
Yeah.
I heard that there was going to be an exchange, a web service-based, AWS-based migration automatically. It would allow you to do date range migration.
I got a question, yeah. Yeah, so let's do a feature priority exercise, and let's see how the audience vote for each one of these. I have one here, and I have a bunch of features that people asked. We are thinking about date range for the merge protocol, which is for cutover and stage. It's a little bit harder for moves, and I'll explain why. It's feasible, but it's harder, and I'll explain why. But nonetheless, it's a priority exercise for us, and we'll have to. Got it. Any other question? Go ahead.
Speaking of following up on the 1990, this is not tricky. It's 2010, 2014, or 2010 is the cloud. Can you tell
I'm not sure. I can't hear your question. Sorry.
Can you tell it to ignore, does it take deleted item retention from 2010 to the cloud?
It takes deleted items, yes, to the cloud. Dumpster is migrated to.
The retention. Can you ignore it?
You can't ignore anything in moves.
To tell it to ignore it? Because sometimes we'll have the user clean out the mailbox before the move, but they then have to dump dir as well.
We can't ignore anything, right? You don't. Got it. It's similar to what he's asking. Got it. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at the troubleshooting sections. So the typical problems that you have are during initial setup or during migration. And during initial setup, you get a bunch of connectivity issues. And let's walk through a bunch of initial setup pains and then see how we can solve each one of these problems. So the first thing that errors that you see is AutoDiscover is not configured properly. And you see an error something like this that says, hey, you know what, AutoDiscover is broken. And if you see carefully in the error message, we ask you to go use this tool called testexchangeconnectivity.com. How many of you here have used that? So you guys are all familiar, so you know what to do. So you use this tool to discover and fix AutoD issues. So you can also run test migration server availability tool with a commandlet that spits out the similar error as well that says for AutoDiscover Go, use testexchangeconnectivity.com. And if you use testexchange connectivity, since you all know, you click the AutoDiscover option, it runs you through a bunch of steps, and then you can walk through these steps and figure out what to do. And if it's all green, then you're good. If it's something is red, it'll ask you to go fix those issues. So I'm going to skip walking through those. Another kind of general error that we get is this general error. And it's not a very informative error. So when you get something like this, we're trying to improve this error. But if you get something like this, then we ask you to go use the commandlet, which is the test migration server availability commandlet. And it's the same commandlet that I showed you earlier. But say it's a bad credentials, then the error message looks like this. And we ask you to go look at the error detail. In the error detail, you have this error that's present in this big chunk of text. But if you look at the essence of this error, it says something like negotiate 401 unauthorized. And this means that the logon attempt failed. This means your credentials was bad. Most likely your password was bad or it's expired. Another kind of error is bad certificates. It's the same commandlet, you run it again, and you get a bunch of stack like this. But if I expand on this, you will see something like cannot establish trust for SSL secure channel. And if you see something like this, it means your certificate is wrong. So go fix your certificate. Again, another one of these, run this again. And if your MRS proxy is disabled, you will see something like 403 forbidden. And so then you go fix your MRS proxy. So by default, MRS proxy is off. So these are the kinds of connectivity errors that we see while setting up the environment. And there are errors that can occur during migrations as well. One of the errors is typically your password expires because you have your migration endpoint for so long. And you will see the same error as before this logon attempt failed. But you can also get large item and bad item limits exceeded. So let's walk through this. So say you have a large item. So if your item is greater than 35 MB by default, they will fail migrations and they will get dropped. I believe recently we added a feature where you can increase the large item all the way up to 150 MB. And so if you have a large item failure, so go ahead and increase the item, and then you can migrate this. So by default, it's 35 still. Another one is bad items. If we cannot read the content of the item, then we fail the migration for that item. MRS can read the subject many times, can read maybe some of the properties, but may not be able to read the body. So we store some of this data and fail the move. And another issue that we see is invalid sequence numbers. So if the protocol between MRS and MRS proxy is something called WSRM. It's a session-based protocol that that has affinity tied to it. So when you run behind a load balancer, it might send it to the packets to a different MRS proxy. This way the affinity is broken. That's why you get an invalid sequence number. The sequence number this is an issue. So you need to fix this by one of the good approaches was tied to an exchange cookie and is stamped by MRS proxy on the first reply. So I have a bunch of slides that show how to investigate these failures. I'm going to skip the slides and quickly move to the dashboard and show it to you in the demo itself. Okay? Go ahead. Can you use the mic? I can't hear you, sorry.
Asking about affinity and preferred architecture of the straight round robin, but MRS is not well, it's migrating items, so you wouldn't want to get consistent interaction.
So why don't I take you afterwards?
So the question is, when we set up Exchange normally with Exchange 2013 or later now, the guidance is not to use session affinity. But you're saying that if we want to then offboard or onboard to the cloud for MRS, we need session affinity. So either we need to change the load balancer config on our side or create another endpoint, is what you're suggesting.
Yeah, so even creating another endpoint, if you will have to bypass the load balancer for that, or you'll have to do some sort of cookie-based affinity.
Okay, thank you.
Because otherwise it's going to spread it out because it's not going to go to the same backend again. And that will break the WSRM protocol. Uh-oh. What's going on? Okay. All right, so let's look at some of these. So how do you go about investigating failures? So we have a bunch of batches with failures. It says synced with errors. And so we're going to go look at the details. And if you look at, there's some bunch of details here that say, hey, what's the direction of this, whether it's onboarding versus offboarding, what type of migration is this, what is the status it was in, and there's this view details link here. So if I click on these view details, I get a bunch of more information. And this is information on a per mailbox basis. So here are a bunch of users in this batch, and they are in various states. So if you look at these users, some of them are synced, and they are synced fine. They have 146 items that are synced, nothing has been skipped. But there are a bunch of these users that have failed here. So if I look at this user, it's got a bunch of details that says, this user failed, and here's why it failed. It says user duplicate in other batches exception. This just means that this user was also attempted in another migration batch, and you can't have the same user in multiple batches. So typical solution is to maybe just remove the user. So I can click on remove over here, and I can keep going down this list. But it gets a bit painful going down this list one by one, because I have to now investigate each one of these users and why they failed. And it turns out each one of these failures is very similar. Each one says user duplicate. So now how do we go about doing these bulk operations in an easy way? I'm going to have Luke here come and do this demo. Luke, take over.
Good morning. Okay, so let's pull up some notes. The only thing I'm going to cut and paste here is my connection information, so connect to Exchange. The rest I'll paste. But this can just be grabbed from TechNet. And while this is importing. I think one of the questions, oh, that's pretty quick on this machine. Okay, so similar to what Ram was doing through the web, I'm going to show what's going on if you want to use PowerShell. And so after logging in, the very first thing I want to do is get a snapshot of the different batches that are going on. So this is the first command that I run. Sure.
It's better?
Bigger?
Bigger.
There we go. Is that okay? I can't see it over there, but it does look small too. Let me make.
You're good.
Okay. Yeah, so similar to what we were seeing before on web, this is a very similar interface where we see what the batches are, see what the states are. We can see a ROM's move here, finished, and it now has some errors. And the first question I ask myself is, okay, it's great. Now I want to actually categorize the errors, see what's going on, and avoid having to look at them one by one. So I then invoke getMigrationUser and focus on looking at the failed one. So this is what's going to do is call getMigrationUser, so look at all the items that we're seeing before, all the different mailboxes, and group the errors. And what I see right here is actually, looking at it at a high level, I see two types of errors. The first one show me specific problems with this mailbox, and the bottom set here, which aren't categorized because it has the user's name in each of the errors, shows me a problem when I submitted the batch, that maybe I had some intersection there with another batch. Yeah, I can see some of the ones that Ram created right here. Mm-hmm. And so the first step, what I might want to do is say, okay, I want to just remove the clutter from the bottom so I can focus on those errors at the top. So one way to do that would be to get those users again. So what I'm doing here is just grabbing those users that are on the bottom there. I'm going to dump it in a variable. And I'm just going to take those users now and remove them. Okay. Now I want to do it without having to hit confirmation. Okay, and while that's going on, so the next question is like what? Now I want to drill down on those earlier errors, and because those are the ones that are affecting the migration, and then make a decision on whether or not do I want to restart the migration for those users or skip over those items. I think one of the questions earlier was how do we preemptively decide whether we want to migrate users if they're going to have these bad items. And I'd say the approach I would take would be, let's do this migration, let's not do autocomplete, let's look at these errors, And if we think that the user needs to be involved, we can remove these migration users, and then we can start to create a new batch for those users. Or if we look at these errors, we can say, look, this isn't a big deal. We're just going to confirm anyway. So I'm just going to stop that and get into the yeah, so now I want to grab those users again. Let's go to the very first one. So have these two errors, and I want to look at the first one. This is indicative of the bad items that Ron was referring to earlier. I'll touch on the second one as well. So this generic sounding error is reflective of the fact that there were problems accessing the mailbox on the source side, that when we were trying to perform the migration, there were too many transient errors, and at some point, we just have to give up, and that's the error we see for that. So looking at the top ones, I want to grab those mailboxes. Now, what I want to do here is call get migration user statistics, and when I do this, I want to pass in an argument include report. Now, this is going to give me all the details of the specific migrations. The most useful things, it'll chronicle the whole migration, show you the times when it performs certain actions, but it'll also show you all the failures encountered, and we can drill down into the specific bad items.
So the error summary that Luke had showed earlier is a new feature on the Get Migration user. It didn't exist until last few weeks. And it's kind of a quick scan of the errors. Earlier, you had to use Get Migration user statistics to get the errors, and it would take a lot of time.
So what I'm looking at right now are just the errors that were encountered for the first migration. And here I see that when I was trying to copy over some messages, that we encountered some corrupt properties. Now, in the message itself, it's going to be composed of many properties, potentially headers and the subject body and attachments. And if any one of those had a corrupted element that for some reason we weren't able to decipher, it would show up here as incomplete copy. So we encountered two of them, and then we had a final permanent exception where we couldn't complete because for this batch we had bad item set to 0. So now I want to take a look at those bad items themselves. Let's take a look at one. I'm going to dump the whole thing. And this shows us what's going on under the covers here for this particular copy. Hard to make sense of this, but what I get from here is I can see what the subject of the message is, and I can see what type of message it was as corrupt. Now, in this particular case, for the demo, we had a hard time creating bad items, so we had to go through a process of manufacturing them as well. So the error message isn't very helpful, and this is just a well-known way internally that we can create bad items. Okay, so and I can continue this for the other job items, but I can just tell you right now they're all the same because I created them all. And now the next question is, okay, now that I have a bunch of these bad items here, like these for these 5 users, now I want to fix them. I decided, look, this is not an error I care about. This user does not care about this message. So I just want to rerun the migration for them and skip over them. And the way to do that, one way to do that, is to take these users or create a new migration batch. I think that should be it. So basically, I want to take those users and use them as a basis for a new migration. What it's going to do is it's going to take a look at the existing batch information and the endpoint for it and create a new batch based on that information. And now let's say, okay, I have this batch. I want to say bat item limit of 10. Oh, is there anything I want to explain?
No. The feature that Luke is showing right now is not publicly released yet. It will be in the next few months.
We'll iron out some of the edges.
So we want to be able to pipe this users to new migration batch and do a bunch of those things.
No, I don't need to restart it now. But that's the idea. And I think for the second part of the demo, I want to pre-populate all the statistics, because that takes some time. Now, what I'm doing right now is just preloading all the reports so that later we can talk about performance. It'll be right there for me. But I think that's it. Are there any questions?
All right, cool.
I haven't put you guys to sleep.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Oh.
Maybe they just typed out somewhere that we can grab
Yeah.
a few screenshots, but I'm not sure if I can use my
What's the best way to do that?
Maybe we'll write a blog and post it, or we'll put it in the deck or something like that. Yeah. Can you use the mic, please, if you don't mind?
That's okay.
You do a get move request statistics and you see the, total time to wait on each of those stalls limits. Is there a better definition of each one of what
The next section we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talk about performance. We'll talk about why the stalls, what they are.
Yeah. So the next demo is really short. It's going to showcase a script we have for it, and
We'll do it in the next
Okay.
one. Yeah. And we'll talk about some of those things. Yeah. Question?
oh, failovers. On the source or target? Well, we will handle it. There will be transient errors. When we do the migration for the hybrid move, we'll do up to 6. We'll perform the same action up to 60 times, and then we give up. So normally during a failover, it'll recover by then.
No. No. We take care of all that. Okay. So let's get back to the deck. So, you have actually, you may not have all the PowerShell commands here. So I'll paste it in this deck and then make sure that it gets back to you. Yeah. So let's look at performance. So up until now, we looked at the life cycle, how to investigate failures. Now, one of the common problems that people have is, why is my migration not fast? And there are two questions I get asked. Why is my move queued, and why is my move slow? And the why is my move queued question has been a little lesser these days than why is my move slow. And there are reasons to it, and I'll talk a little bit more about these various things. The first thing is queued. So when you kick off a migration, what happens underneath the covers is a migration service issues a bunch of requests to MRS. MRS takes it and puts it in a queue, and then processes it in certain priority order. And so that's why some of these requests can be queued, because if a single server gets 1,000 requests, then they are processed in that order. It won't, because we have a lot of servers, but in the case. We said, okay, let's go analyze our queue duration. Let's see how much time customer moves are waiting in the queue. And we found, and this is an analysis we did a while ago, but it's still relevant, that 95% of the moves are queued under 15 minutes. So that's pretty decent. But then there are this 5% of these requests that do take a little bit of time. And some of these requests are queued, we've seen, due to bugs and due to other workloads. We've seen them queued for a couple of hours. And so we said, hey, you know what? We need to go solve this problem. and we need to make sure that the experience is a bit more predictable. So one thing that we did was went and adjust the throttling in the data center. So to explain what we did, I have to explain to you how we manage a little bit of throttling, some basics around it. So in the data center, we have many workloads that are running in these servers. And these workloads are prioritized in various orders. So in this box, I show from lower priority down to higher priority. And what we call lower priority workloads is we call it discretionary. And as we go up, we call them customer expectation and interactive. So an example of interactive is Outlook connecting to Office 365 and downloading email. So end user experience is most important. So we don't want to screw that up. So we give them the most amount of resources. The next, and at the lowest end of the spectrum, we have load balancing, which is we have a lot of data center operations, like we move hot mailboxes from hot DAGs to empty DAGs. We move and load balance a bunch of these mailboxes. And for this, it runs at the lowest priority workload, which is discretionary. Onboarding used to be a discretionary workload. It used to be running at the lowest priority. We found that was not acceptable, and so we did a bunch of work and moved onboarding to a higher priority. This way that onboarding work gets picked up ahead of load balancing. So internal Microsoft projects also get scheduled in discretionary. So if there's an overwhelming number of migrations that we do, it will not have any more affect customers. So earlier we did 14, 15 upgrades, and that caused a lot of problems to customers, and those things all go away now. So the time in queue should be more predictable, should be more manageable with this improvement in the last 3 to 6 months. We have done this. So it's around that time frame. So that makes it a little better now. So another thing is performance. And customers ask me, hey, what will be my throughput? Well, I really can't answer that, because when we went and did an analysis in the data center, this is how we saw the throughput variations. We saw throughput anywhere from 100 megs to a few gigs. And we also did a correlation of that with latency. And we found that the latency, higher the latency, lower the throughput. And it was correlating. So the stalls, and the thing that's called stall duration is actually a function of latency. And so higher latency means lower throughput. So, but on an average, you can expect about 400 to 500 megs at 100 millisecond latency. Now, how do we go about investigating some of these things? So at this point, I have a slide, but I'm going to ignore that slide and going to give it a look to demo this script. And this script is something that we blogged a year ago, and it's in this page that you can go run this, and Luke will show you how to use it.
Yeah, where the location for that script is explains it very well with all the summary. Okay. So I've already copied it over, hopefully. Yeah. Load it into my namespace, and now I want to invoke it. So the input for this are the set of move request statistics with all the reports, and the script is going to parse it and dump a bunch of information, aggregating all the information it found. So first thing I want to talk about, can we talk about the move efficiency percent? Mm-hmm. The move efficiency percent is a measurement of the data transferred versus the actual data that exists on the source. And so a perfect scenario would be 100%. More realistically, it would be around 75% or higher. And so a lower number indicates that there are many transient errors, and that when there's too many transient errors, service has to give up and restart, and it loses all the data it had copied up to the watermark where it saved it. So generally, if you see a number lower than, like even this is right at the threshold, it might be worth investigating into further detail, looking at these transient exceptions and figuring out why they're occurring. Now, for the purposes of this demo, we created a single box source server that was definitely underloaded, under-resourced So we know that there are problems connecting. The next thing I take a look at are these transfer rates, and specifically this one here on the bottom, the average per move transfer rate here. This is a measurement of the data that was actually come over the wire. This is relatively low. Do you want to say something?
Latency.
Oh, yeah. And one reason we can talk about why it's low is this latency here, which is measured in milliseconds. This latency is a measurement of one of the most basic commands that our service uses to measure the connection and initiate the connection. So the fact that it's taking this long is indicative of a problem. Again, our source server is underloaded or under-resourced, so that it's not surprising that it's so high.
So we would like it to be around 100 milliseconds. So you get a decent throughput if it's 100 milliseconds. And I'll show you how to mitigate some of the latency impacts later.
Yeah, and you can modify some of these if you are having problems with it to not time out as quicker. Okay, the next thing I look at here is the stall durations. Like, why is it taking a long time? And it's filled up primarily from proxy unknown stall. This error is capturing all the errors that our service in data center recognizes from the source side. So we don't know specifically why it's slow on the source side. So it bubbles up as proxy unknown stall. Again, we purposely made it slow for this demonstration, so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. But if you're seeing something like this, the next step would be to look on the on-premise server and investigate what's going on there.
So another thing that is, if you see, typically you'll see that source side durations are higher than destination side durations. And that's typical because our data centers are beefy and supposed to run fast. But if you see destination side durations very high and systematic, then that means there's a problem with the data center. You should escalate to support. And this way we can investigate what your problem is. So expect source side issues. And if you do expect destination side issues, raise a ticket. So that's what I would say do. Right?
Yeah, and Ram will publish the location of the script, which has a lot more information about it.
Any questions? So there was a question here.
What are the scenarios where a user will be throttled during a move request?
So the scenario where you will be throttled if the box is running really hard. So since this is a customer expectation workload, there is a CPU limit, and that's one reason. Another would be we have a second data center constraint, which means that we need 2 copies of this data in 2 data centers. So if you're moving too fast, then we'll throttle the move so that that copy can catch up. The third is indexing. We do content indexing as we move. So we want, when the mailbox is switched over, we want all the search to work just instant on, so that the user experience is good. So those are the reasons we get throttled.
So what we see is, so if we have large batches that contain mailboxes over 10 gig, those batches get throttled.
So the batch itself get throttled on the, and I'll talk a little bit more about why you get throttled, where you get throttled on that front. So I was talking about throttles on an individual move. On a batch, I'll talk about it. Any more questions? Go ahead.
So if you have multiple data centers, on-premise and mailboxes from different regions, India, US, are there any guidelines?
Yeah. So the way you do it is you create multiple endpoints, each endpoint pointing to that region, and then migrate batches through that endpoint, and then configure and throttle on those endpoints, because you can't represent all the endpoints in each one of those. So that would be my guidance. Make sense? Okay. Go ahead.
Easy one. This script and the bad item count when you showed us, are they going to make it into the on-premise exchange?
It is there.
So these only 365.
You can run the script on-premise as well.
Yeah,
The script will on-premise. And what about the bad item count checker?
that's there as well.
That's ours as well.
Yeah. So all the information that the script uses comes from the report, and the report is part of the move request, so it'll be there.
Yeah.
I think it's just a question of digging into it and aggregating, which is what the script's good for.
All right. Any questions?
Guys, we're out of time. It's 10:17 now. Can you cover stuff that's not in the slide?
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's go. All right. So I'm going to skip all this because Luke talked about it. So what is the best way to improve throughput? So there are two ways to improve throughput. One is increase the max migration concurrency. So this allows you to move, this specifies the number of mailboxes you can migrate concurrently at any point in time. So the max we allow is 100. And so that means you can move 100 mailboxes concurrently at any point. That kind of adds a lot of load to the source environment. If you do want higher concurrency, you can make a request and we will consider it. We've had people ask for 300 or so requests, 300 concurrencies. That's one way. So that is, in aggregate, you will get a better throughput, but an individual migration will not improve the throughput. Another way to increase is increase the buffer size. And this is a feature in 2013. And there is a setting in MRS proxy called the export buffer size override. And this ensures that the chunk of data that you send over the wire every time is bigger. So by default, it's 128 KB. So if you take a high latency, high bandwidth network, by increasing the chunk size, you reduce the chattiness and therefore minimize the impact of latency. And so bigger chunks of data means that you will get higher throughput. And this actually works better for larger mailboxes, say greater than 10 MB. And this is only supported in CU3 Plus and E15. And the diagram on the right shows that the most benefit you get is during the initial sync phase, not during enumeration, not typically during finalization and incremental sync, provided there's not a big churn during finalization and incremental sync. So typical performance gains is in this phase. And we've seen good performance gains by increasing this chunk size, anywhere between 30 to 40%. So I would say please try this if you have a 2013 proxy install on-premise. This is a good way to go and increase your throughput. Okay. Another way is also to author the batch such that you go against multiple source servers. It's not just a bogged down one. So especially if you see that your analysis shows that your source server is getting throttled, then you might want to go to a bunch of other source servers and mix the batch a little bit. Of course, you can add capacity source, but that's not going to be feasible, I know that. So another thing that, how many of you here are familiar with Fast Track? Okay. So Microsoft has introduced this new program called Fast Track. And this program will help you migrate to the cloud. All you need to do is go to this URL and request an onboarding request, do an onboarding request, and we'll take care of work with you to set up your environment and do the migrations. And it's all managed by Microsoft and it's all free. And so if you guys are thinking about migrating in the next few months, I highly recommend go through the Fast Track route because we'll handhold you and migrate you to the cloud for free and set up your environment and migrate you. So let me summarize. So today we looked at what are the migration options. We did a deep dive on hybrid moves. We did some troubleshooting of common issues and looked at how to improve performance. What are the performance bottlenecks and how to improve. The key takeaway I want you to have is we have a simple set of tools that will help you migrate to the cloud, and we will help you also migrate to the cloud. And so I encourage you to use Fast Track. Thank you very much.